They were some of the most exciting launches I got my hands on. They were also the source of my addiction to being in the launch business. I keep thinking, hey, I once was actually part of the launch of this product, and it's very fulfilling. The learning I took away was sometimes you got to go headlong into a market and you've got to be prepared to disrupt it in ways that people don't realize it requires disruption. How you experience any product matters, right? It's not just about why you're taking it, but how you're taking it. It's a very exciting time for insights because of the data that fuels insights is just exploding.
Welcome back to Innovation Impossible. In each episode of this podcast, we dive deep into the world of product innovation, bringing you insightful conversations with industry leaders behind some of the coolest products in fields as diverse as smart devices, crypto, fashion, logistics, pharmaceuticals, and many more. Our guests share their processes, challenges, and triumphs in creating groundbreaking products. From who to hire to the systems they created at enterprise companies, from research methodology to marketing, from innovation frameworks to the challenges they faced and how they overcame them. Whether you're a serial entrepreneur working at an enterprise company on an insights or innovation team, you're a product designer, or you just love product design and innovation, Innovation Impossible offers practical lessons and inspiration to help you navigate your own product development journey. Joining us today is Arvind Balasundaram, Executive Director of Commercial Insights and Analytics at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. From Pfizer to Chemical Bank to Johnson and Johnson, Arvind has helped deliver insights on a variety of products you're sure to know, including Viagra, Zithromax, Lipitor, among countless others. With over 35 years of experience in the industry, Arvind has been uncovering powerful and actionable insights and leading teams since before I was born. I'm personally super excited to learn from his unique perspective and share a slice of the wisdom he's gained in this changing landscape. Welcome to the podcast, Arvind. I'm really glad you could join us today.
Daniel, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about being on the show and you know going back in history a little bit, but also living through the evolution of where we are going with technology and insights. I couldn't be more thrilled than talking to you this morning about the subject that we're going to talk about. So looking forward to it.
Sometimes a product's approved use is different from what they were originally developed for. For example, it's well known that Viagra was originally intended for a cardiovascular benefit, but was eventually approved as a treatment for ED. In your experience in healthcare, how do you identify and leverage these unexpected insights to reposition your product effectively? And are there any examples which highlight why understanding the right target audience is critical for the trial and adoption of these new launch brands?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Daniel, and it's so Viagra was a very interesting product, right? So the good news is in our industry, we have a clinical evolution, and by the time commercial moves in, we kind of know what the indication and approval are about. So we can't obviously do any kind of promotion or anything until we know what the approved use is, right? So the good news for us is even if, for example, in a clinical trial, the a situation like Viagra, unfolds, um, you kind of prep into a commercial readiness that you kind of know what you're going into, right? So it's not a fully uncertain situation on the commercial side. Now, what's interesting about Viagra itself, right, was that it was not only a brand launch, but it was actually a category launch. In many ways, it was very different. We were still in the space of small molecules, as basically pills as opposed to injections, but it was a highly stigmatic condition. It was also what we would call, a much more experienced disease state, because the involvement of the patient, I mean, they're involved heavily in any disease state, whether it's cancer or hypertension or whatever. But this is so highly stigmatic and it's so very symptomatic to kind of go into a completely new disease state such as Viagra, to shape it, to understand the attitudinal bottlenecks that might exist, uh, was a very new launch readiness in itself. So what I would tell you is, I don't think we were taken aback so much by the indication being different. I think what was full of surprises on that journey when I reflect back on it, which by the way was one of the most fascinating launches for me in terms of learning about consumer mindsets, learning about customer involvement, patient involvement, learning about stigma and things of that nature, is just the surprises in the insights business, right? When you go in thinking, hey, this must be something that is very obviously a problem, and people would jump for a solution to that problem, and when you go in you find out, hey, there's a lot of other things that intervene behind the intention to the behavior, and that was what the biggest learning was in that product. And I think that's what happens with some of these types of launches.
That's amazing. And were there any, like, can you share some of the challenges that you faced, like trying to educate your consumers and maybe their partners as well?
Oh, absolutely. And the product is generic now, so I can speak to some of the things in the public domain, not everything. But the big surprise was, and I kind of knew this when I was on that launch, because one of the things we find in healthcare, at least at that time, and I think it's generally true even today, is men and how they deal with conditions is very different from how women deal with conditions, right? And particularly in stigmatic disease states like this, it's men just will not go to a physician. I mean, it even now, if somebody even doesn't have a non-stigmatic disease state, the way men and women approach disease states is different. We know that from insights over multiple therapeutic areas. But in this particular one, the one insight that kind of stands out to me over the years, and I don't think I've seen it in any other disease state as much as this one, is the expectation, as I said, was when we launched the product, and when we were thinking about getting ready for the launch, obviously it was all about the men because they were the patients. But what the learning really reinforced was that even though they suffered from the condition, the fact that they would actually reach for a solution wasn't entirely dependent only on them. In fact, if we depended only on them, we could be sitting for years, because they are not going to go talk about this condition, leave alone to somebody they know well. They're never going to do it with a physician, right? So that learning, I thought, when I reflect back, was profound, right? Because you are going into an ecosystem where suddenly somebody like a significant other becomes very important, because with men, especially with that kind of a condition, they need an environment and an immediate support structure where they can kind of talk about it. And very quickly it became apparent that significant others and partners were very, very important in this conversation. And there were some specialties that we didn't originally think about that might actually feature in the equation, like OB-GYNs, which you wouldn't think would really matter as much as urology. But they potentially could be a source where you talk about this condition via a partner to kind of bring people into the office, right? So it's a very different type of approach one has to take. But I vividly remember this as being one of the learnings I stored away in my head, for all the future experiences that I've been through. So thank you for bringing that up, because it is one of my favorite launches from a learning perspective.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating product, and I'm sure there was a lot that went into it because it's almost it's a shared condition. You know, it's not only a issue for the men, but it's also an issue for their partners. Um, and can I ask, how did you land on that insight? Where did you find that? Where did you realize, like, oh, we need to involve the partners in the conversation?
Yeah, and here's where I think, Dan, the way you do research really matters, right? I know you and I have talked about this topic. We'll probably talk about it in the course of our chat today. But there's a lot being made out of technology and how it's going to automate and stuff. But fundamentally, when you get to understanding inertia, understanding latent habits and stigmas, there's a fundamentally human dimension to it, right? And that involves listening and how people express sentiments or how they express stigmas. And listening is still a very human feature because it's rooted in the experience of stigma, in the bottlenecks people face, in things they really want to do but can't automatically do. And so it came down to, rather than asking people questions that we typically do with any launch, sometimes you want them to tell you stuff without you having a very, clear agenda of how you want to take the questions. Because, in insight, sometimes the most profound surprises you get pertain to unlocking some kind of tension that exists. And human beings are not very good at putting words to tensions. They have to be revealed, right? And so the whole way we got the insights there, and it's been true of many other brands, right? And it's true today, is how you listen, right? And some of the deepest insights, like this one that I just talked about, are expressed in very, very, nebulous ways. But when you connect them all together, I think it brings you to something you were never looking for. And you recognize this tension and you say, hey, how do I unlock that tension? Because it's rooted in a patient actually getting a benefit for a highly, highly, uh, you know, uh, impactful condition they're suffering from, but in a way they're comfortable, both emotionally, in terms of their habits and so on, right? So it comes down to a very different way to do research and how you collect insight, particularly on launch products, right? So that's what I would tell you.
And I mean, you've done this quite a few times, I think, where you launch this groundbreaking product that there's no existing consumer behavior kind of that. Well, I guess there's the need for it, but they don't have that behavior. Say, for example, with Zithromax and Lipitor as well. In general, like, how do you develop these reliable insights with these consumer behaviors that don't exist yet?
Yeah, you're bringing up all my favorite products. They're from many years ago. They're all generic now, but they were some of the most exciting launches I got my hands on. They were also the source of my addiction to being in the launch business, because it's just so profoundly exciting in terms of, uncovering insights that you have to do driving forward, looking through the windshield instead of the rearview mirror, right? So I think when you go to Zithromax and Lipitor, right, they all present unique challenges. But Zithromax, by the way, is one of my favorite products, partly because I when I launched it, it was exciting. It was a very different innovation in the marketplace, but especially because now I see my dad taking it as and in a generic form, and I keep thinking, hey, I once was actually part of the launch of this product, and it's very fulfilling. When you've been in my business for a long time and you see a benefit, and several of my friends take it, I get. So it's a great product. So thank you for bringing that up. I can talk.
For those who might not be aware, what was it that was groundbreaking about it? What was this change?
Zithromax was an antibiotic, a macrolide, which is kind of a subcategory of antibiotics. But what it really brought to the equation was, when it launched, most antibiotic therapy required an administration of 3 pills a day, some 2 pills a day, mostly 3 pills a day for 10 days, right? And you can guess what the issue here is. I mean, if you think of yourself, you know, with an infection, a bacterial infection, and and you now have to wait at least 4 to 5 days before you actually have some semblance of feeling better, right? Because it's that's how an antibiotic works, right? At least in those days, you couldn't deliver everything that you needed for the pathogen load that you have all immediately, right? And this becomes a real problem in infections like ear infections. If you think about kids, right, ear infections are painful, right? And we call it otitis media in our language. But if you think of a parent with a child who has a ear infection who is experiencing pain, to have to wait as long as they have to wait to get some relief is not only traumatic to a child, but it's also to their caregiver, right? So
Yeah, we went through that earlier this year. It was very hard.
Oh, I'm sure, right? It's agonizing. And so, you have this ecosystem, and in that you have an antibiotic that comes in and says, hey, you know what? I'm going to do what different people do in 10 days, 3 days, 3 times a day therapy. I'm going to give it to you in 6 pills. I mean, it's a profound innovation, to basically say, yes, I know you need efficacy. Everybody needs efficacy. Physicians need efficacy. But convenience matters in this marketplace. Convenience matters to the patient. Convenience matters to caregivers. And that's what the Zithromax story was about, right? And what we went through there was interesting, and it pertains to, how do you launch a new product when you're bringing in something like Viagra, right, but in a different dimension. Here you have the difference being, you have several products already to treat the condition, but a key feature that you're bringing in is unrealized, because there's nobody else who can give that quality of therapy in that short a duration.
And so there's like a trust barrier that you have to overcome. People don't believe that it can happen.
Yeah, I think the challenge there becomes, you're going up against a very established legacy of what's important in a treatment, right? And that's what that whole thing was about. Um, we kind of went in a market that was dominated by efficacy, right? So all that mattered at that time with an antibiotic, obviously, and that is the business we're in. It's not about selling pills. It's about, and the FDA would never approve something that wasn't efficacious. But, for physicians, they often want to reach for the most efficacious product, right? And so you were up against an efficacy metric. We were efficacious. There were probably efficacious other efficacious products out there. Some maybe even a little bit more efficacious than what Zithromax brought in. But what it highlighted there was convenience was equally important to a patient, and you had to bring that whole piece into an ecosystem that hadn't experienced convenience, right? And that doesn't happen overnight. So where the Zithromax launch went was, how can you deliver efficacy conveniently, right, rather than staying just on a theme of efficacy. you know Talk about that efficacy also being bundled with convenience, right? And what does that do for a patient, and how quickly can you get to them feeling better and things of that nature, right? And so that was a different launch in than Viagra or Lipitor. Is how do you shape perceptions of a brand, and obviously we would never compromise what matters to a patient, right? What matters to a patient or physician is the science. It's ultimately, you want to be going forward with something that makes them feel well. But if you have a dimension that makes them feel well in a more agile manner, as we did with Zithromax, you've got to start bringing that also as part of the conversation, because it matters to a patient, and eventually it matters to a physician treating their patients, and it matters to parents with screaming kids. And that's what the emotion of Zithromax was all about, which was tremendous to experience, right? And so I still remember, when we went into otitis media and children's ear infections, we had a little zebra that, because the zebra was part of kind of the Zithromax branding. And but how we were able to bring the science into the experience was I think a very important piece of that campaign. I thought Pfizer did a really brilliant job with that, without compromising any of the scientific basis for the approval of Zithromax.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. And what was the kind of that core consumer insight in the end, that people do want to feel better now?
Yeah, the core consumer insight was, that conveniently delivered efficacy actually mattered to everybody involved, right? They just didn't know how important it was, right, until you actually could show that people were willing to make some trade-offs in terms of getting some really good efficacy, maybe not the best efficacy that was available, but getting very good efficacy for a shorter duration of therapy, right? And so it meant going into understanding the trade-offs involved in a predominantly single driver based choice that people were making, which was efficacy driven, right? But once you kind of showed them that there was a choice, that you could get convenience without actually compromising a lot of loss of efficacy on an approved medication based on its science, that kind of changed the conversation. And as you can see now, you pretty much, it's a generic product, but it's almost always given now for where it's appropriate, because convenience matters for compliance, right? You never want a patient who starts on a 10-day therapy course and stops it halfway because they think, hey, I'm feeling better, and so maybe I don't need that last bit, and then there's a rebound, right? So it's almost now become the way it's administered that azithromycin, which is the generic name of Zithromax, is now routinely given for a range of infections for which it's appropriate, because people comply with it, right? Because you have limited number of pills, and you get the compliance, and people take it for the entire course of the therapy, which is much easier to navigate than what we had before. So that was really the insight, Dan, that I think the learning I took away was, sometimes you got to go headlong into a market, and you've got to be prepared to disrupt it in ways that people don't realize it requires disruption. I think we've seen this beyond healthcare, right, where people have gone in to spaces where it feels like, hey, this is the way this place works, but when you get underneath it, again, I go back to what is that tension that you have to unlock with your insights, because if you don't unlock a tension, your insight doesn't really move behavior, and so you have to hold it up to a much greater metric. Is that tension there, and are you differentially breaking that tension? And Zithromax a perfect example of that. There was tension, and Zithromax unlocked it, right? And it unlocked it so effectively that now it's become, even as a generic, a very preferred option for physicians and patients.
That's such a great story. And I wonder like how much that influenced other medication as well. Like this takes me back. I think Seinfeld had a stand up in the 90s about, do I want my cold medicine to be fast acting or long lasting? Do I need to feel good now or later? You know, and so that idea of convenience and fast
Absolutely.
acting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But now switching gears. So these are completely new launches. But what happens when you're kind of late to the party, you know, and it's a late launch? How do you still become a market leader? I think you've done that in the past. I imagine a lot of this can be attributed to the brand story and perception. Could you tell us about how insights can shape and create this kind of unique brand positioning?
Yeah, you mentioned Lipitor, and again, Lipitor has gone generic, so I can speak to it. But it um, so what Lipitor did to me, right, from a learning standpoint, is Lipitor was late to the statin market. It was, I believe, number seven or number eight, right? And what that brand taught me was that every launch, no matter where in the order of launch you are, fundamentally does bring something novel to the experience, right? And so let me speak a little bit about that, right? So the issue with cholesterol, always, even to this day, is cholesterol was always a risk factor, right? So unlike um, let's say cancer, or any condition that is actually you're experiencing today, in those days, cholesterol was always a risk factor to a heart attack.
Yeah.
That's how it, I'm going back, that the education has considerably evolved since the days Lipitor was launched in terms of how people deal with cholesterol, but I'm going back to those days, right? and much of the communication was around risk factor, right? You don't want, high cholesterol, you don't want high LDL, HDL, because it will precipitate a heart attack. And that had pretty much been kind of where all of the brands before Lipitor went, right? And so you had several really good brands that were all speaking to the heart attacks that you're going to get. Now,
But that's
when
also a big
Lipitor,
challenge, isn't it? Because
it is, and
I mean,
it's scientifically true, correct? It's important, but so you don't want to not be talking about it, because that's why people were taking statins at that time. That's why people, and that's what's scientifically correct, right? You don't want to go in and say stuff that you should take something because you should take something. But how you experience any product matters, right? It's not just about why you're taking it, but how you're taking it. And that's the insight with Lipitor, right? What Lipitor did was it fundamentally realized that heart attacks matter deeply to physicians and to patients. That's why the drug even exists, right? But it's also important for somebody who is taking this thing day in and day out to know what it's doing every single day, right? So it's not just about, yes, it will prevent a heart attack, but it's also about knowing that you took something today that's actually making you better today. There's an insight about today that exists in tandem with the prevention of the heart attack, which is why they are doing what they're doing, right? And
yeah,
so the whole campaign on Lipitor and where it went with, the emphasis on daily lowering your daily numbers, that the fact that you took something and your cholesterol is going to be lower than if you hadn't taken something. It's a very trivial piece of, you think, hey, that's obvious. But, at that time, it really mattered to somebody who was taking chronic therapy for a risk factor for an event that might happen without them taking it. So, what that campaign did, when I reflect back on it, was it really again emphasized why they were doing it, which was the event prevention. But then everybody else was also doing that, which they should. But it also reminded people that the fact that they were doing it daily was actually lowering their numbers as they were taking it, which was a very profound insight that patients really needed to know.
yeah,
Because you kind of assume if it's a chronic therapy, they'll just comply with it. They might not. They might take it for 6 months, and we have a number of chronic therapies in our area where we just assume, yeah, if you have that condition, obviously you would take it. But that's not how the world works, right? That's not how people work. And especially in a situation like cholesterol management, where it's a risk factor that's trying to prevent an event, sometimes you can have complacency and say, hey, the event hasn't happened, maybe I should stop taking this thing. So the whole campaign on Lipitor to go to daily lowering of the numbers, I really reinforce compliance. And compliance is always good for physicians, right? When patients comply with their therapy, it prevents a heart attack, right?
of
and
course.
and that's how Lipitor, even being very late to the statin ecosystem, was able to really, you know position itself as being highly relevant for the condition for which it had been approved, right? So it's again a third nuance, if you will, Dan, of, you know just entering an ecosystem and understanding tensions, right? And the tension here was, you know in order to improve compliance with therapy, you have to regularly remind patients why they're doing what they're doing, even if it's a pill. Even if it
Yeah,
means just swallowing a pill, sometimes that is deeply motivating to a patient, because they are reminded why they're doing it. It's actually a relevant activity in their day. And I thought, the insight that was revealed there was profound. When I go back in my showcase of brands and what I learned, it was incredible. That the team and where that went. Again, within all of the approved science that we had, you still have to uncover the emotions and the how do you get a patient involved in the care, right? And this was very well done.
This episode is brought to you by Prelaunch.com, the consumer and product validation platform. Why trust your innovation to market research dinosaurs who still rely on professional panelists to gather insights that you'll probably never use? When you pay your respondents to participate, their only incentive is to get through it fast and get paid. This practice has led to the growth of professional respondents, low quality responses, and even bots. Instead, on prelaunch.com, your future customers pay you before sharing their insights. Regular users discover your product via ads while browsing the internet, and if they actually want to buy it, they can place a small deposit to reserve it. This confirmation of purchase intent changes everything. Now, instead of straight lining through the answers in order to get paid, they're actually invested in your product development process. Their only goal is to co-create a better product for themselves. Prelaunch.com lets you test everything from pricing to product features, business models, audiences, messaging, positioning, and everything in between. Discover how you can gather bulletproof insights from your ready-to-buy customers on Prelaunch.com today. It's a very powerful shift in focus as well. There's this old adage in copywriting that it reminded me of selling the painkiller, not the vitamin, because it's hard to for a person to imagine this is helping me in 10 years time or 20 years time compared to this hurts now, I'm going to fix this now. So it's kind of bringing that the effect of what you're taking to the short term. Now I can feel myself getting better, or I can see some improvement rather than I'm working towards some long term goal.
Yeah, and the big difference though that I have to point out, right, is we're a regulated industry. So you know for us, promotions is not the same as promotions for other people, right? So we cannot just say whatever we want to say. It's always got to be contingent on why a product has been approved. So you know all of the brand stuff that happens in on our side always happens against a bigger context of why the therapy exists in the first place, right? So
Yeah.
it's a I would say it's a little different on what you can say about conditions, and that's a good thing, right? Because you always want to be protective of the patient and why they're doing it. But at the same time, I think the key piece here is the science is profound, right? But the science has to move from the clinic, I mean, from the lab into the clinic, because that's where the behavior occurs, where a physician writes a product, a patient consumes the product, and sometimes the science is important in terms of why a product is written. It's fundamental, but all I'm saying is sometimes the patient needs a reminder, or needs to be engaged in the care in a way they see relevant to why they're doing it, right? and
Yeah, in a
and
way
that
that speaks
unlock
to them.
correct, that unlock was what Lipitor was able to do really, really well.
And so you mentioned that these brands, Viagra, Lipitor, Zithromax, they're now generics, and I wonder kind of how that transition goes. So once you suddenly get this influx of other generic brands competing against the thing that was your IP, how do you kind of reconsider your differentiators or your brand's position to maintain or even strengthen your brand relevance?
And then there are different approaches there, right? And there's a reason why we have, the exclusivity on the brand for the time we have it. There's a reason why we have generics in place. And there are different ways companies deal with it. There's a brand stickiness to the branding sometimes, and generic doesn't necessarily is not equivalent to a brand, because there's different dimensions of what goes into a branded molecule versus a generic molecule. I don't want to get into some of that, but for example, it may be what we call bioequivalent in terms of its manufacture and its composition, but the how it delivers what needs to be delivered to the site of action could be different, right? So generic could be bioequivalent but not get what needs to be achieved in the same manner, right? So there's different features, there are differences in features even if the molecule is similar. But outside of that, what some companies do is they sometimes have what we call a branded generic, or increasingly what we call a branded biosimilar, which would essentially be the brand the company had, but it would be in, competing in a generic ecosystem, because of the advent of generics. And that's sometimes done that way. Other times it's just purely operates as, generic at that point. It depends, I think, on circumstance, and it depends on priorities the company has. It depends on how much, there's stickiness to the brand in terms of how you can take that forward. So there are many things that come into issue there. Um, I wouldn't say there's a really carved out strategy, that people follow or not. Um, it ultimately has to focus on, hey, if patients want the product, if they still find it differentiated, they still find it useful, then staying engaged in some form of feature in that space is important, right? And that's how it's pretty much handled.
I mean, I kind of, outside of the pharmaceutical industry, I'm seeing it now happen with Jaguar and their rebrand,
Yeah,
realizing
yeah.
that the old customer base isn't really providing that financial benefit that they need. And so they're kind of having to reinvent their brand for a new audience and attract new people to it. Um,
Yep.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to take a complete left turn here. And I remember when we were talking before, you mentioned this idea that before Apple, nobody really cared about the packaging. But Steve Jobs believed that even the packaging is a core part of the brand. And he kind of developed this new unboxing experience and packaging that people, they don't want to throw away, they want to hold on to it. How do you view this in terms of how brands now have to not only be disruptive in terms of the benefits they offer, but also in how they shape the mind and behaviors of their consumers?
I think the example you brought is so fundamental now in terms of what I would point out as the evolution of branding, right? In the last, I would say, maybe 5 to 7 years, right? Is we used to be in an ecosystem of branding as perception, right? Where what mattered was, how does somebody see your brand in the mind, and how can you stand out in a crowd, based on how you're visualized in the mind. That has profoundly shifted now, right? Now it's more about engagement and experience. How do I feel your brand? How does your brand stick to my daily life? And that's what this is about. The example you just brought about. I think what Apple achieved, and they do it at significant costs, right? Because the way they package it, yeah, I mean, it's got to. I'm sure there's a cost line item there, but they still do it because the experience of opening the package and the way you peel those things off, and how things are looking so beautifully structured inside the box, and then you open it and you see this metallic beautiful looking computer with the apple in the middle of it. I mean, it is such a dimension of experience. And I use Apple, and I, whether it's an iPhone or my Mac, I still have vivid memories of when that box arrived, and how I peeled it off. And I know people who store those boxes. They have a place in their closet even in New York City where they might have to move out to store those boxes, but they won't get rid of those boxes because that is a dimension of, it's like Christmas, right? Opening something you've been waiting for, with longing, and it shows up, and you kind of participate in the process of that uncovering. It's just so profound that and what I think Steve Jobs and Apple did with that is they branded the experience of opening a box with a computer in it, and in such a way that no one else can move into that space. I mean, I can't see Dell, or I can't see anyone going into that, because some things in life with experience often need only one person there, and Apple owned it. And so I think the
Yeah.
reason they continue that is it gives them a stickiness of experience that I think it's very hard for a second mover to come in, right? So if you analyze that whole branding, it's a very big part of the Apple experience, and if you took that away, it genericizes the experience, right? And it's a great example, Dan, that you brought up. It's the same thing you see, for example, in the Nike swoosh, or the Intel Inside sound, right? When you hear that, only one person can have that. I mean, it's so first mover driven. uh,
Yeah.
I think many companies miss the importance of doing that, because it gives you traction for a very long time based on something that people take as might be relevant to an experience. But the big point here is we are in an experience universe. We are in keeping people engaged, which means the relevance of the brand from the day it arrives till the day you're ready to make a change and continue within that brand umbrella has to be owned in a unique manner. And Apple does that better than many people. Yeah.
And I think the impact in the industry was far reaching. You say that nobody else could do it, but everyone else imitated it. I'm not an Apple user myself. I have a Pixel phone, but now the unboxing experience is pretty much iPhone like, iPhone inspired.
Yeah.
And I'd say also it's not, they kind of even extended it beyond receiving the package. I think the shopping experience on the site, in the stores, they're the genius, Apple geniuses, that whole shopping experience, and then the trading in the phone to get the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, from start to finish keeps you in that ecosystem, keeps you enjoying each little moment in that journey.
Yeah, and it's a continuous journey, right? Because when packaging is so fundamental to your experience and differentiability, how do you kind of manage that in a world that is increasingly becoming aware of sustainability, of climate? How do you keep that experience and stickiness when you might have to compromise some fundamental elements in the way you introduce your brand? I mean, these are tremendous challenges for a company like Apple or Samsung or whoever, right? But they, I'm sure they have teams working on the stuff, and but when you think about it, you think, oh, these are trivial things, but they're not. They're fundamentally all about brand stickiness and the need to think about these things and evolve your brand story and keep your customer and keep that experience and engagement alive is what brand relevance is, right? And the interesting thing is, you know I can relate to Apple very easily, and people might think, hey, you know what, in healthcare it's much more removed because we have a derived demand model, right? So our patients don't write the products, physicians write it for them. But increasingly, with conditions like obesity and eczema and all of these types of conditions, the pain experience, it's not like receiving an apple in a cute little box. It's exactly the opposite, right? That's the other challenge you have in healthcare, is the experience you're dealing with is not one that you wanted, right? So how do you then keep your product relevant when your science is very complex? You're talking about a condition that's a pain point. It's a pain experience. It's not a pleasure experience, a pain experience. But the outcome of it is very, very important to the patient because of the condition that they're going through. So, all of the same emotions come into play, but in different ways, right? Is That's what makes healthcare and what I do with insights. I'm really into it, as you can tell, because it's a very profound thing you bring in, right? Is I know branding sounds like it's commercial and all of that, but ultimately branding's about giving the patient an experience and a relief from pain based on science that is predicated and approved, but doing it in a way in which they understand that science, in a way they realize the experience that's intended for them. And that gives you a lot of satisfaction, right? And that's where branding kind of comes into healthcare, right? It's a little different than Apple, but it's as important.
And so I wonder, with these experiences, I've heard you say the insights should also be experiential. Could you kind of break this down and show how you apply it to new brand or new product launches? What are experiential insights?
Yeah, so the where I would go into experiential insights, and this matters because of where technology is going, right? So if you go back to a few years ago, we relied a lot on spoken and stated word, right? So we would be behind a focus group, we would be watching, people talk about things, and then we'd come back and we'd look at a text rendition of what they expressed or what they said, right? But increasingly with technology and where we're going is the insight itself can now be analyzed as it was expressed or intended. Because of multimodal AI and all of these things, you can actually go to audio, you can go to video, you can, so there's an insight that is understood as it was being experienced and rendered, which is different from the way we used to do it, right? And that's again when you go back to the question we were just talking about, which is I'm now going out of, I think there's going to be three prerequisites to be a good insights person, especially in a launch environment. Something was intended is extremely important to understand stickiness and personalization and all of those types of things, right? So one of the things that I think everybody is doing is trying to go deeper into, you know, understanding stickiness of brands to single people, right, to individuals, as opposed to this mass market understanding of insights, right? And for that you need experienced insights, and that's what I keep talking about, which is go more to the source, the raw source of how something was said, understand deeper sentiment of expression, understand the tonality of how something was said, so you understand really what that deep insight is and not just what was said. Because going forward it's going to matter a lot, because if you don't have that insight, you just understand what was said, not what was intended. And if you want to go to behavior, you have to go to what was intended. And
Yeah.
that's what I want to say about experiential insights.
I love that idea, especially if like the personalization. But I mean, if we bring it to something more concrete, like I'm all for it. How do I do it? What is this? How do you chase these individual insights? Where do you reach these people as they're having the experience? What does that look like in day-to-day
Yeah,
research?
and that's the $6 million question today, right? Is we are in, for years we've used and relied heavily on structured data, right? What we you and I are talking about now is unstructured data, which we are only now starting to tap into because of the technology we have, because of artificial intelligence that we have, deep learning, neural networks, and all of that good stuff, right? So how you kind of personalize is going to come down to not just reaching people, but being able to actually get to a lot of content that we never really were able to use before, right? And that is one of the starting points for us in terms of how you start personalizing. I mean, we're all talking about omni-channel now, and that's what it's all about. How do you go from an n of whatever 20 segmentation schema to an n of one schema, right? Which means you need to understand, who do you target, for example, you know how do you target them, and what message do you use when you target them, and how often do you target them, right? These dimensions are require considerably more detailed understanding of that person than we used to have before, right? So you need to understand the preference structure of how you engage with personas, right? Which is why we use a lot of the word personas now. How do you orchestrate your relationship with those customers? And that's where all of our insights is moving, as opposed to kind of that mass understanding of how do we do it, how don't we do it, and that kind of stuff. So
Right.
it's still an early space, Dan, but I think you're going to see a lot of stuff coming at us in personalization, orchestration, and individualized experience, and how you take things forward in that manner.
And I wonder, like, we were talking about launching new brands, new products, new experiences. Um, how do you how do you validate these insights? Because people might say that they have this problem or that they would use your product, but how are you kind of sure that what they're saying is the truth and that they are your intended target audience?
I'm so happy you asked that question, right? This is a problem that in spite of technology, has not changed, right? Is you have to be smart in the way you design your research, in how you acquire your insight, to really get to not what people say but what they mean, right? And there are different ways to do that, right? There's a slew of insights techniques that get to, you know, people saying things in different ways so you can validate what they say. That the other techniques that connect, you know, what they say to, you know, choices they make, and seeing whether they're consistent, they're not consistent. All of those things are getting to be more and more rigorous, right? Because people say a lot of things now. It's very easy to say a lot of things, but, you know, there's also now lots of content where you can validate across different channels whether what they said is consistent, right? So that's kind of how we look at it. Is insights is a complicated space now because of the amount of information we're dealing with, but also people are interacting in different media, and you got to tap into different sources of insight and corroborate their persona and how they think and all of that, as opposed to just relying on, you know, one survey that, you know, they say something and then you kind of fly with it. So it's a complicated answer, but, you know, it comes down to sophistication of technique. It comes down to validation of approaches that look at different ways of understanding behavior, and it gets to customizing to single personas what you see repeated in what they're saying, right? And that's the only way you can do it, really.
And I imagine that's getting even harder nowadays with AI. On the one hand, it's simplifying certain jobs for the researchers and the consumer insights professionals, but I imagine it's also making things tricky in terms of the gathering insights. Do you see problems with increasing survey fraud or lower quality responses in what you're gathering?
I mean, that problem does exist. I mean, I don't think that's changed, but I think it comes down to how you recruit. And you know, there are, again, there's sophistication that is happening on that front as well. But, you know, one arena there which is quite exciting is what we call synthesized respondents, right? With generative AI, being able to use AI to kind of create synthetic responses based on responses that are trustworthy. And you know, that's a whole brand new thing that we're looking forward to. I mean, it's very, very early in that space, but those are all ways in which you can increase the quality of your input, in a couple of instances, right, where you don't get high quality respondents, or, you know, it's just hard to source them, like in rare disease spaces and things like that. um, there are many techniques to do that, right? But I think you'll always have that quality piece, right? Which is why it's very important that in insights we keep it a quality of insight journey, as opposed to a quantity of insight journey.
And how do you see AI driven personalization becoming more accessible, and like how's it going to change the way healthcare brands approach their audiences?
Oh, the AI is going to fundamentally reshape personalization. It already is doing it. You know, one of the biggest ways, I think, is just because of the data that's being generated. We're using, you know, like algorithmic ways to understand patterns in data, as opposed to, you know, what we used to do, which is just rely on very limited data to construct hypotheses, right? So you know, with omni-channel evolution, for example, you know, we've gone beyond looking at just, you know, within channels and doing what we need to do discreetly, not kind of, you know, harmonizing all our channels. It's becoming clear even in healthcare. We're a little behind some of the other industries in personalization, but there's a lot of machine learning and, you know, those types of techniques to really get to understanding how to personalize in an omni-channel ecosystem. We're using attribution modeling, so you can kind of, you know, really attribute an effect based on what you do to understand whether that personalization is actually being delivered, whether the experience is the way you want it to render it. So that whole space is just starting to rapidly change. I know healthcare, we're a little behind, but we're catching up pretty quickly, right? Because our data is a lot more disconnected than some of the other industries, but that's all changing, right? And it's becoming more granular. There's more data available. So I see a lot of change in that area.
And is that going towards like this future where I can just, this is my pill. It deals with all of my personal issues. I can take it.
I don't know if we'll get there. I mean, there's personalized medicine that's going on, but that's more a clinical. There's obviously the economic, uh, implications of it. Could be very expensive to personalize to everybody. It has to be feasible. That's a domain I'd rather not weigh in on because I don't fully understand the science of personalization. In terms of the biology involved, but I think personalized care is already happening, right? And so that's a dimension where you don't necessarily get your own pill, but the kind of care that is rendered to you is customized to the condition you have, the environment you're in, the issues a physician's dealing with you as a patient. So all of those we will learn with AI, right? Because there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of and synthetic data, you know if and multimodal LLMs, if at some point it's approved for use, where obviously we can't use it right now because of privacy issues, but we might be able to get to data that we don't see now, right, while retaining the privacy, and protecting the privacy of patients with techniques like synthetic data, right? And so all of this is going to change in 4 to 5 years. I'm excited about it, but hopefully we'll do it in a proper fashion after all of our compliance and legal and all have looked at it and blessed it. But it is being talked about in the AI circles.
So you haven't mentioned this directly, but I think you've kind of touched on this idea of co-creation with stakeholders, involving your consumers involving them directly in the insights process. How do you approach this concept, and what are some of the benefits that you're seeing from involving these stakeholders more directly?
Yeah, I think the reason co-creation becomes important is again an issue we talked about before, right? Is how do you take something complicated in the realization of the experience of a benefit, right? So often, there's a conceptual benefit. Let's say a medication would provide a patient or up to a physician, right? And when that becomes complex, like in the science, like when you go into like oncology or some of those areas, we're in the biologics business now, right? Most of our products are now in injectable form, and the science is very, very profound, and complicated even for physicians sometimes to grasp, right? And so one of the examples I think of co-creation is, um, we have apps, right? Many apps now are very, very beneficial in helping customers, particularly patients, really relate to what the benefits the medication is bringing to them. And then we see this across the board, number of healthcare companies, whether it's in managing diabetes or heart conditions or skin conditions. So an app is a perfect way to co-create with stakeholders based on what you're trying to take forward versus what they really want out of what you're bringing, right? And when you have an aligned experience, um, that app could be very, very good in monitoring compliance, ensuring that therapies, people are complying with their therapies and so on. So there's a lot of co-creation going on in that space, Dan, that I think will continue in our business because the complexity of the science is not going to go down. And compliance and adherence to therapy is a very important piece when it comes to managing health, right? So that's
Mhm.
just an example of co-creation that's happening, I think, across the board.
That's interesting. So there are these apps that they're using to track their own health journey, let's say their medication, and then you're gathering insights from them and changing messaging or your approach and seeing how they respond to it.
Yeah, you can't like change messaging, you know because we're regulated, right? So whatever messages go, they have to be approved, and those cannot be real time because there's a process to what we can communicate. But it's more the experience of what you can communicate, and the complexity of the therapy that a patient is in can sometimes feel a little different. For example, if you take diabetes, or with the weight loss medications, or you take antipsychotics, these are all conditions where the state of a patient in any given day is very important for their own well-being, right? For example, you don't want your sugars cycling all over the place. You don't want, you know in your you don't want positive negative symptoms manifesting randomly when you're in if you're taking antipsychotic medication. You don't want a side effect profile that's known to be intervening with how you comply with that therapy. These are all things that can be administered through apps, right? Because it can connect, essentially a physician and a patient, and it helps overall, not only the managing the therapy for the physician and the patient, but ultimately the manufacturer as well. Because if people comply with therapy the way it should be taken, the patient's better, the physician feels better about it, and there's less issues to deal with. So, apps have been really, I think, transformational in kind of getting that shared experience, in some form, going. And now with wearables, right, being able to connect it to automatic monitoring of things. We're going into what we call connected health and the Internet of Things, right? Is I think it's going to become very, very important that people get into the state of mind, especially with very complicated therapies that have a daily you know rigor around monitoring. Like in diabetes, you're going to see a lot more sophistication in terms of co-created um, offerings.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dimension. I'd never really thought about that. That before it used to be you got prescribed something and then you might have a touch point with your doctor every few weeks, every few months. But now it's immediate, every day, every time you take it. If your watch is tracking your health throughout the
Exactly.
day,
Exactly.
even if you
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
know if you're feeling better, the expert in charge, the team behind it, they can kind of see, is this working for this person or not?
yeah, and that's where some of the AI stuff that we were talking about earlier matters, right? Is now the amount of information that is being generated is explosive, right? Just because of you wear an Apple Watch, go to sleep, everything's there. The question is, you can't still touch it because of privacy mandates, right? So, um, you know someday will we be able to look at all of these things? Yes. And that's where, again, synthetic data matters, because if there's some way one can look at the relationships in various parameters in these data sets without compromising where that data came from, might be informative to things we don't fully understand today, right? Relationships between things. But we're very early in those days. It's got to be examined by folks in our shop, and by the government, because ultimately we have to protect HIPAA, we have to protect the privacy of the patient. And so, will all of this change maybe 5 years from now? Maybe. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants better care for sufferers. And if there's learnings that can be done without compromising privacy, it is
Yeah.
something that would be interesting to look at, done properly, and blessed by the appropriate oversight authorities, right? So I'm optimistic about these types of things. It's a very exciting time for insights, because of the data that fuels insights is just exploding, right? And then how we kind of not get overwhelmed by all of this, how we can effectively connect them to unlock that tension I was talking about. That's going to be the adventure forward, right? And
Yeah.
so I know I've done a lot going back. I wish I had as much time to do stuff forward, but I'm very, very excited about what's coming at us. So.
That was a great conversation with lots of amazing insights, Arvind. I wonder, is there anything, any last bit of advice you can leave for the insights professionals of the future? What can they look out for in this changing landscape?
So the first thing I would want to say is they should feel very excited about what's coming. That said, I think there's going to be three prerequisites to be a good insights person, especially in a launch environment, right? One is, I think, what's different from when I graduated from college is we have way more data than we need, right? So I keep talking about this as building a quilt, right? Is you've got to first be able to curate your data so you're able to pick the data that is pertinent, the insights that are pertinent to the question that you're asking. Then you got to be able to integrate it because now we have technology, we have AI that can deal with multiple modalities of data, right? We're not stuck just to numeric structured data. We can use images, we can use videos, we can do all kinds of things, right? So, how do you integrate all of that content together? Yeah, I mean, that's going to become an increasing competency in the insight space. And then the third thing is how do you get a narrative and build that overall quilt, right? Is how do you story tell what matters by way of a launch, a brand? What is that insight, and why is it pertinent? Why is it relevant to the question that you're asking? Right, those three things I think are going to become very heightened for one single reason, Dan, which is what I was referring to as the migration to quality of insight. We've been for a long time a quantity of insight industry. I think novel platforms, new ways of asking questions, understanding behaviors, uh, they're all going to be expensive. AI is great, but it's expensive, right? And if you want to scale these kinds of things, it's going to come down to what return do you deliver on the quality of what you get, right? So the one thing I will say in passing is we've got to make that shift, right? And stop thinking about all the things we have to do by way of numbers of projects and initiatives, and focus on what is the least number of things we need to do to get the most number of insights. And I think innovations like that, platforms like that bring new things to that way of thinking are going to be very, very successful in the launch space. And I can't wait for that to happen. I think it's already happening. I think some of the stuff you guys are doing, not what Narek's doing, it's a very innovative way to start thinking about all of the information that's around and how you connect it, so you kind of optimize value, right? And I think that's kind of where things are going to go, and I hope people are ready for that.
Thank you so much, Arvind. This was an amazing conversation with so much depth. I feel like I'm going to have to watch this episode quite a few times for it to all sink in and for me to truly understand it. And I hope all of our listeners really enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you so much for being here, Arvind.
Dan, thanks so much for the opportunity to, yeah, to Narek and you to ask me to kind of share these thoughts, and primarily for stirring up memories I don't think of every day, but every time I talk about it and think about it, they were very formative in terms of what I'm doing today, and they bring back very, very pleasant memories, and they're a constant reminder of why I go to work. Right? Is ultimately we want to get things to people who are suffering, and being able to do that in a very novel way, and being able to do that with some amount of an understanding of what keeps them from getting that today is just a very, very uh, good endeavor and a good pursuit. And thank you for reminding me of that. That's what kind of was at the back of my mind with the questions you're asking. So really appreciate the opportunity.
I'm really glad. And it was really great for me to discover it too. And I'm sure for all of our listeners hearing what happened behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Arvind.
Thank you, Dan. Cheers.
Hope to talk to you again soon.
Yep.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today for another Innovation Impossible story. I hope you enjoyed the insights and all the practical advice as much as I did. Please give us a like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. We're just starting out, and like innovating, this feels impossible. And head on over to YouTube and let us know if anything resonated with you or if you completely disagreed with anything, and we can spark some healthy debate into the world of innovation and insights. Thanks again to our sponsor, prelaunch.com, our guests for joining, and you for listening today. And see you again in a couple of weeks.